So I'm really glad to be here, and to be here actually presenting after having worked for many years with the Race Institute and with CUBA, and even before then with the Planners Network chapter that was here with students, and always been impressed by the work that you all are doing, and I hope that this can help inform that. So again, my name is Josh Lerner, and I'm the Executive Director of the Participatory Budgeting Project. But I won't be talking about participatory budgeting or PB so much today, but rather about my new book, which is called Making Democracy Fun. And there are a couple copies. I guess, Janice, do you have one? Is it?
This one.
Okay. Floating around. There's supposed to be a box of them arriving today. It didn't arrive yet, but hopefully it will soon. They're also available online and elsewhere. Actually, I want to do a quick go around, and if everyone could just say their name and their favorite game. Any volunteer? It could be a video game, it could be a sport, it could be a board game. Your favorite game to play or to watch.
I'm Andrea Alvarez, and I'm with Citizen Advocacy Center, and I still to this day have week-long risk board games with my dad and my aunts and cousins and my husband, so we play a lot of risk.
You're in the back, Andy. Say that.
I'm Tia Crum. I work here at the Great Cities Institute, and I also do a lot of projects in partnership with the student housing and engagement. My favorite game is Street Fighter.
Nice.
My name is Carmen Aiken. I'm in my last semester in urban planning policy program here at CUBA. Yes, my favorite game is soccer. I guess if I have to choose, just for playing football and watching.
Good job.
Hello everyone, I'm Joe Horace. I'm Director of the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement. My favorite game, I guess my favorite computer game is SimCity. It's a planner. And I don't know, sport.
My name is Owen O'Neill from University College Dublin in Ireland. So I make sure that it's in different Gaelic football. It's native to Ireland, and I play it a lot, so my favourite one to play, and soccer to watch me. Participate in sports.
I'm Janice Thompson, and my favorite game is Monopoly. It never gets old.
My name is Adam Rowe, and my favorite game of all time would be a Nintendo Super Tecmo Bowl.
Peter Glick, I'm an evil banker. My favorite computer game is SimCity, and my favorite game to play as well.
My name is Courtney Brower. I'm with the McCormick Foundation, and for nostalgic reasons, my favorite game is ColecoVision Smurfs. If anyone remembers that.
What is it?
Smurfs. Smurfs. That's small creatures. And I love to play tennis.
I'm Janita, also from the McCormick Foundation. I'm a big fan of the Resident Evil Silent Hill.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Thomas with the Garfield Park Community Council. It's a neighborhood organization on the west side of Chicago. With my kids, I'll preface it with my kids, Twister, Monopoly, and Risk.
I'm Rachel Weber. I just introduced myself, and I guess it would be Trivial Pursuit, because I know a lot of useless crap.
Hi everyone, my name is Cecile Carroll. I'm the co-director at Blocks Together, also on the West Side Small Community Organizing. And I'm blanking on games because I remember not wanting to play games because my sisters and my cousins and my brothers are cheaters. And I just would always just watch, but I would never participate because I just found not to be such shenanigans. But I do like the little game where you have the memory card up here that I play with my kids with the different Disney characters. That one is the band's game, yeah, but other games I'm just stay away from. But these kind of games I like.
Matt Sweeney with Ipsy, and I would say my favorite Nintendo game is original Tecmo Bowl. No offense. And sports soccer.
My favorite sport is basketball.
here visiting with also with Ipsy. Favorite games. Huge sports fan, so sports video games, and also the Assassin's Creed series. It's historical in a sense, and violent. So I love it.
Hi, my name is Shanique Pickett. I am the director of the Social Lab. My favorite games are Wheel of Fortune and Spades.
My name is Arnold Castleton. I'm also finishing my master's urban planning in about a week. And I guess my favorite game is to jump into a city I don't know and get lost and find my way around.
My name is Katie James. I'm with the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement. And I guess my favorite game would be one that I created with my family when I was little called the What If Game.
I'm Norma. I work at AFC as well, and my favorite game would be Mexican Bingo with my family, and to play soccer.
Great. And in the back row, I can hear your name and your favorite game.
My name's Walter Fisher. Citizen of Uptown. The most interesting game, but not my favorite, old school political wars of the city of Chicago. Characterized in a book by Milton Rayco called We Don't Want Nobody, Nobody's.
So I'm glad to hear that everyone plays a lot of games. So a couple questions. So we heard a bunch of games. How many folks here have played or watched a game in the last week? So play, video, board, sports, raise your hands up higher. Okay. How many folks here have been to a community meeting in the last week? Not bad for I think this crowd's probably biased. What I want to talk about today is why that's different. So why are people investing so much time in games that have no impact in their lives? And more than on meetings which actually shape their lives, their neighborhoods, and their cities. And what can we learn from all those great games that you talked about? And how can we apply that to planning and policy and democracy? So I'm going to mainly tell a story from the book. The book is largely story-based and try and draw out its lessons learned from those experiences. And it's a story about a participatory redevelopment program in Argentina that's so successful that after its first round of meetings, the residents chased the program staff out of the neighborhood and staffed them. So I'm going to talk about what they learned from that and what that staffing did just about making democracy fun. But it's a true story. As Rachel mentioned, most of my work now is around participatory budgeting. But before that, my job was kind of to go to meetings for a living. So I did lots of research, as many of you are doing, also did a lot of facilitation. And so I would go to whether it's community board meetings or neighborhood group meetings or public hearings and see how they work, evaluate them. So people were showing up, if they're paying attention, and how attentive staff were. So it's kind of like reviewing restaurants. You want to see if people are having a good time, if staff are meeting their needs, if they're sticking around, if they seem to be coming back and staying for more, the quality of the offering, what's put out there. Except the problem is that most public meetings are really awful. So it's like if you're reviewing restaurants, now you could review as one-star restaurants, where the standard is there food? And that's the basic criteria. If there's food, it's successful. If there is a public meeting, then that's success. Because we crossed off a list, it was on the calendar, it was required by law, and so we had a meeting, and great job, everyone. So like many of you, probably, I feel like we could do better. Why is it that we have such a low standard for community meetings, for participatory democracy, when there's so many other great models out there? So I went off on a quest to see if we could find a better way of doing things. I went off in a couple directions. One was toward Latin America, where I'd done some work before and been to a lot of really inspiring processes that people were actively engaging in. They seemed to be having a good time, coming back for more, and trying to figure out what was it that made them more effective than a lot of them I saw here in the States. And the second direction I went off in is games. I happened to have a couple good friends who are game designers, and I was really impressed with how much careful thought goes into designing a engaging game experiences, and how little of that I saw for planning and policy and organizing and government in the same way. So what could we learn from those experiences? So, as my 2-year-old son would say, I went off on an explore down to Latin America and to Canada. And so I'll talk about one experience here in the city of Rosario in Argentina. So Rosario, it's second or third biggest city in the country, depending on who you ask. You ask people from Rosario, they'll say it's the second biggest. You ask everyone else, they'll say it's the third biggest. It's on a river, it's old, in an industrial town, lots of social movements, very progressive political history. So kind of like the San Francisco of Argentina, but without the Google buses and with a lot more steak. It's a bit different. And the city had been doing a lot of very innovative programs, one of which dealt with shantytowns. And so in Argentina, like in many Latin American countries, there are shantytowns throughout the city. In Argentina, they're called villas miserias. And in the villas, there's really no basic infrastructure. So there's no paved streets, there's no legal or reliable electricity, water, sewage systems, unemployment is extremely high, they're very violent, a lot of gang activity, a lot of people coming in from other countries, from the campo, from the farmlands, to come to stay where their farms are bought out. When it rains, the streets turn into a big muddy stream, and pools of sewage glistening on the sides of them. Not great places to live. The city started a program called Rosario Habitat with the aim of converting these shantytowns into regular neighborhoods, with streets that are paved, with electricity, with sewage systems, with health centers, with schools, the basic things that we want in a neighborhood to live in. You can see on this map up here, so this area is the old shantytown. So you can see all these little, very irregular lots of land. So each of these was a shack, basically, that someone owned. The city wanted to put in streets. So beforehand, these streets were not there. The red ones, says Mavakaye. And so they wanted to put in new streets so they could install basic infrastructure. It's hard to put in sewage systems and electricity and water on these things if there's no streets to actually access the buildings. And so they proposed putting in these new streets as a way to install basic infrastructure and to improve the overall quality of the neighborhood. A challenge, though, is if you're putting in new streets, then people have to go. You can't put in the streets and still have everyone there. So the city went in at first with this program and put forward a plan that looked pretty much like this, and said to the residents, we've studied this carefully. This will enable us to install basic infrastructure. Those folks who have to move will get new houses. It'll improve everyone's quality of life. People are pretty excited about it. It would be a really big improvement for them. Residents actually signed on these plans. They had meetings where everyone came out, reviewed them, signed on them. And then a few months later, it came time for the construction crews to come in and for the families who were on these new streets to move. And the staff came in with the construction equipment, and families said, no, we're not moving. Staff were shocked, they'd agreed to this, but they hadn't really known what they had agreed to entirely. They weren't developing those plans. And so they chased the staff out and got stabbed. And the program said, all right, we got to start over. This isn't working. And that's where things got really interesting. That's what I tell you about, is what they did instead of this process. And what they did is they integrated a lot of games and game design, and I'll break down how that worked. The first step they did is deciding on rules for the process. There were some fixed rules that came with the program that were not very flexible, but were actually pretty good. So basic things like, if someone had to move, they would get a new house that the city would build. All of the lots that were going to be left after this had to be at least 90 meters squared, so that you would have a basic living area. So a lot of some technical considerations like that people actually wanted, and there were kind of guarantees as much as there were rules. But then there's the question of, if someone has to go, how do you decide that? How do you decide the priorities of who stays and who goes? And so they asked the residents themselves to come up with rules to govern that, and to identify basically criteria that would dictate who would get priority for staying. And so they asked people to brainstorm the criteria. So for example, if you had a job nearby, or if you had lived there for your whole life, or if you were a single mom, or if you had a physical disability, things that would prevent you from living a social life if you moved. People brainstormed the ideas, and they voted on them, and they rank ordered them. And this is through some participatory workshops. And so by the end of this workshop, people had a list of the fixed rules that they wanted. And they had these additional rules that governed who would stay and who would go, what they had decided on themselves. And to mention that even before getting to this point, they started out by getting people on the same page and using some games to break down some of the barriers and the norms in the villas and the shanty towns, and get people to collaborate together. So even before doing this workshop, they had an initial meeting where they brought everyone into the room, and the facilitators from Lucia divided people into tables, so you can imagine breaking out the tables, and on each of those tables put a pile of puzzle pieces, and asked people in each group to complete the puzzle, but without talking. And so you had people in these groups that were putting together the puzzle pieces, trying to piece them together without talking, and after a couple minutes they weren't able to do it. And so she said, okay, round 2, now you can talk to each other. They started talking to each other. They still couldn't figure out how to put the puzzles together. And she said, round 3, now you can talk with other groups, which wasn't actually forbidden beforehand, just no one had thought to ask the other groups. And so suddenly people went into their groups and saw that each group had a missing piece in their table. And they got the missing pieces, put the puzzles together. And folks got it pretty quickly, and Lucia asked afterwards, what was the point of that? Why did we do this at the beginning of the process? And said, we're not going to be able to engage in this without working together. We have to work together and communicate openly across groups. This is a community process. It's not just about me individually. And that laid the groundwork for them to work together and to break down some of the individualism that prevented that process from working at first. So they had people working together, getting to know each other on the same page, with rules laid out. And the next step, which is really critical, is to decide basically where the houses would go. And so they had a series of workshops called Loteo workshops, so basically lot arrangement workshops, modeled after thinking Tetris. Imagine most people know here we try and fit together these differently colored shapes, hills, rectangles, squares. And so they made cutouts from this transparency paper, colored transparency paper, and superimposed them on the map of the block. So you can see here a map of the block, these transparency cutouts, each one represented 90 square meters of space. And asked people to arrange them on the map. And a lot of these people, some of them aren't even literate in Spanish, they didn't really, hadn't engaged with planning or zoning or anything like that before. But they managed to lay out the pieces, put them together. This took several workshops to get to agreement on, or get close to agreement on. And the last workshop I went to there, where had it almost worked out, they were trying to finalize the last details of it, and they still had a few houses that they weren't sure where they would go. So this is after actually, I should mention too, that even though staff hadn't been staffed recently, there was still a lot of violence in the neighborhood. And they had to push back this last workshop. There had been a couple robberies at gunpoint of staff. So people from the beaches had gone into the staff offices, robbed them at gunpoint, and gone back out. And so the workshop was delayed, and we finally did go in. We had to be accompanied by some of the municipal guard for security reasons. So, people were enjoying this, but it's still a very tense environment. So this workshop, we're looking at the map, and this guy, Mario, as he is just staring intently at the map, this big guy with a skull cap on, and he's just looking at it, and suddenly he points over to one corner of the map, and you can see it on his hand, there was a tattoo of a skull. He's pointing at it, and he just shouts out, that street is on top of my house. The house that my dad built with his bare hands. So you want to move for this damn street. It's a damn, it's something worse than that, but I'm not kidding. And he's just furious. And I can see the staff look at each other, not really sure what to do. I start to inch towards the door a bit, not sure what's going to happen. And then that's when the most amazing thing happened, where one of his neighbors said, whoa, wait a second. The only reason that you're moving is because of the rules we agreed on. Because other families have higher priority over this land, you'll get a new house that's actually better than your current one. And you'll get ownership to that plot of land, to that house. And this is what will enable us all as a community to get the basic infrastructure that we need. Others chimed in. He was still really angry and frustrated. But he looked at the staff and said, check with the planning department, see if you can change this. But if you can't, I'll move. So he wasn't happy with it, but he accepted it as a necessary condition for improving the whole community. So you can see at the end, this is what the map looked like, where they had basically a new plan for the block that was designed by those residents. The other big outcomes, you can see a picture, this is before and after. So before the picture showed before, after the program was finished, showed paved streets, electricity, new houses. And once they did this the first time, they would put these posters up in the workshops so folks could see very concretely what was going to happen as a result and what did happen as a result. And it's a pretty huge transformation. So and for me, that's one big lesson of this story, just seeing this neighborhood transform so dramatically. But for what I read about in the book, and more broadly, that's really just a starting point. What I'm most interested in is what this can tell us about the other work that we do, about planning and policy and democracy more broadly. So I'd like to step back now and talk a bit about what happens here. What made this successful that you could then apply to your work. So the three main things that I found through this. First of all, that using games and game design in participatory processes made them more fun and engaging, but also made them work better. So it's not just about a nice, fun, happy process, but actually people were more satisfied with the decisions. They were better able to reach agreements. They felt better about the program afterwards. The staff felt better about the program, and it was better able to accomplish its goals. And this is across other programs I looked at as well in Canada and Argentina. So game design can make democracy work, not just make it fun. Both of those. The second thing that I found, which Rachel was asking about before, in a sense, was it doesn't always work, actually. So games are not a magical solution to all of our problems. And I saw a lot of cases where they didn't work, actually, where there was manipulation of participants, where the games were a way to trivialize participation, where they actually weren't very much fun. Overall, the experiences, they were very effective, but not all of them. And I wouldn't want people to think that we can just do this and instantly it will transform planning and policy. And one of the happiest reviews I got in the book recently is that I'm an unblinkered optimist. So it's not just blinkers on, but seeing that games are great and they also have challenges. And I want folks to walk away from that with that lesson as well. The most useful thing that I found from it, which I think can apply to a lot of our work, is that game design isn't just about sprinkling in some games or some points or a leaderboard into a process. It's about redesigning experiences and structures. And design thinking is systematic and requires a lot of careful thought. It doesn't require a game designer, but it requires understanding how game design works. And understanding that it's not just like MSG where we add a little bit of it and suddenly it makes everything better. But that there are a lot of structures that have proven very effective in games. So the three that I'm going to lift up, going back to the workshops that we talked about, the first is this idea of artificial conflict, which games have. So think of any game and there's some competition or conflict between players. Whether it's between players, between groups, between players in the system, so a game like Solitaire, you're competing against the system. But it's also artificial. So there's competition within the confines of the game, but outside of it, not as much. So when you're playing soccer and you enter that soccer field, it's very competitive. When you leave the soccer field, it's not the same level of competition. And the game space is what enables that. So if you look at the Loteo workshops, they created a game space here. So game designers will call this a magic circle. So this idea that you enter into a magic circle, and within that space, special rules apply. And you actually voluntarily agree to accept rules that make your work efficient. So if you think about soccer again, if the goal was to get the ball from one end of the field to the other end of the goal, it would be much more effective to pick it up and run into the goal. It's a pretty frustrating rule that you can't pick it up. That's what makes soccer fun, though, is the rules that limit our behavior. And so people within this accepted the certain rules, and that's what made this experience rewarding and enriching. It also focused the conflict. So it was no longer about this neighbor versus that neighbor. It was about pieces on a puzzle within the constraints of a system. So it was a group challenge to figure out how are we going to get these pieces to fit together within the systemic constraints, which is the challenge a lot of planners face. That we have systemic constraints for what can and can't be done. We have to work with people who are not used to thinking about those systems. And so this was a vehicle for getting folks to think about and work with the program as a group to addressing those challenges. So that was the first thing that I did, establish artificial conflict. Had very clear rules that were seen as legitimate and actually built by participants. So if you think about games, all games have rules. And the rules can be limiting, but also very enabling. When people understand the rules, and when they ideally even help create them, then they believe in the process and are more willing to invest in it. So having the rules be very visible and upfront, and like physically in the space, actually on the walls, build people's buy-in and enable buy-in into the process and enable them to engage effectively. And then the last thing that all games have, is measurable outcomes. So when you play a game, you win, you lose, you get a certain number of points. It's very clear and measurable. In Rosario Habitat, the outcomes are you get a whole new neighborhood, and they made it very visible. So it's not just an abstract concept. This is what it will look like if you engage in this process. And often we don't make those outcomes visible enough. That's one reason I think that participatory budgeting works very well, is that you'll get to decide to spend $1 million, and it will be spent on concrete improvements in your neighborhood. So these three things, which are the foundations of effective game design, so artificial conflict, rules, and measurable outcomes, shaped this whole process so that it wasn't just about adding a game into the beginning as an icebreaker, which is good. And I did that, they did that, it's very effective. But it's more about redesigning the whole process to have to be more effective and to make democracy something people actually want to engage in and can engage in effectively. So with that, I will stop and glad to open it up for questions. And there's a couple of copies of the books floating around. There's also cards, which are at the door, which House Grant Else wants them with the URL for ordering it. And there should be, again, a shipment of books arriving here soon. Probably not today, though, I'm guessing. But thank you, everyone.
Save some time for questions.
Where is this neighborhood located relative to, say, commercial core, or where in is it closer to other areas where people would have a desire to live, or is it in the outskirts of town? Is it in an area that is been traditionally underserved, or what is the arrangement of the city around this area?
Yeah, so the shanty towns it's not just one area, it's actually spread throughout the city. So there are several dozen large shanty towns throughout the city, in the downtown core, in the periphery, all across. A lot of them sprung up based on geographic chance, so around abandoned train tracks, for example, or an old plot of land in a building that was torn down. So it's not really with a particular rhyme or reason. The new housing that was built, which I know we were asking about, but it's relevant too, that was spread throughout the city. And actually, it's interesting, one thing that I found this process very effective for was sparking a lot of questions. And when people started to engage in this way, then they demanded deeper engagement in other aspects of the program. So at first, the city had certain plots of land where they were going to build the homes. Once people learned how to play the game, then they demanded a participatory process for deciding where those new lots of housing would be built and what they would look like, and actually to revise the floor plans for the new apartments. And so it was really, this process was kind of a starter drug for them of getting them focused on figuring out how to effectively engage with and shape this program. Maybe we can take a few more questions with the folks in the back. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
You asked us to introduce ourselves with what we're interested in playing. So there were a variety of games, but also technology-based games. The actual case study focused on Rosario, Argentina, and that example was very hands-on, face-to-face participatory. So, what does the reality of technology, face-to-face, hands-on game development look like for us? Because in essence, you may have two different universes, and how do you make them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first half of the book is about Argentina, the second half is about Canada, the other two programs we look at, precisely for that reason. Say, okay, great, this works in Argentina and the shanty towns. What about in highly developed North American cities? And what I found is that the processes look different, but the basic design lessons are the same. And this is what game designers will tell you too, that it's effective games are not effective and engaging because they have shiny graphics. They're effective because they're well designed. And that if you take a game design class, the first thing they'll often ask you to do is turn off the computer and to develop a game using paper. And cutting out pieces of paper and modeling the basic system of a game before you try to code it or to design it, because folks often get so focused on having it look nice that they don't spend enough time with the design and the process. So that's sort of what I try and do in the book is that technology can be a tool, but it's not actually the solution. The solution is good design. And you can use technology for that or not. But the real key is having processes that are designed in an engaging and effective way and to create meaningful experiences for participants. One thing I think is exciting about that is that it opens up the possibilities for how we can use games, so that it's not dependent on hiring an expensive firm to design a flashy video game for you. In Argentina, in Rosario Habitat, the cutouts that they got, they actually, they started out, their office was moved to an old abandoned office building, and they had this workshop the next day, and they were looking for materials to use for it, and they found an old filing cabinet of old reports. And the front page of the reports were these transparencies. So they just ripped out the front cover, all these old reports, and cut them up, and that was their main material. It cost them nothing, and it was highly effective. So you can do really effective games, really effective game design processes without a lot of technology. A lot of games now, they're also blending that line, so it's not, is it a digital game or is it a face-to-face game? It's, digital technology is being integrated into face-to-face processes. In Boston, for participatory budgeting, we're using SMS engagement tool. So kids are in meetings, but also using their cell phones. And it's not either or. But I'd say really focusing on design, for me, that was one of the key lessons learned. That it's not about technology, it's about design. And then you can think about how technology can best plug into that design. So we could go around, take three, start Janice and move up.
Awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really like about games is role play, where you can pretend you're somebody else, and sometimes it can open you up to say things you might not feel comfortable saying. But I'm kind of wondering if you use role play in the context of, say, a neighborhood planning game, are the decision makers going to listen to it? Like, I know it was used, for example, in Participatory Chinatown. I don't know the details of that, but like, can you address the whole kind of pros and cons of role play as a game technique?
Yeah, and some of the games I talk about in the book address that too. What role play can be really effective for, and even more beyond role play, characters, which are the component of a lot of games, is that they can, on one hand, allow you to act in a different way than you would normally. So it's an excuse to test out different roles. So a lot of games like Grand Theft Auto really thrive on that by getting people to play very different kinds of lives than they would normally. and to experience that, to see different perspectives of things. We use games a fair amount in some of our participatory budgeting trainings also to get people to play the role of a crotchety community participant and see what it's like to engage that person and to think about other ways people may show up to your meetings. So they're really good for allowing people to test out new ways of acting and for understanding different perspectives. It also is fun. You can have a lot of fun with them, so you can call them silly names, you can have contrived scenarios. So they're a good way to inject some fun into a process and around a actual scenario that enables people to prefiguratively model how they'll actually act in that scenario. What's that?
My question is kind of like, are there downsides? Like, say the community participates and gives a feedback in a goal.
Yeah.
Will the decision makers then kind of discount that and say that's not what they think? Or that was my question.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that's where I think so role playing or characters is one particular game mechanic that can be plugged in. If you just plug that into a process where there's no power and there's no outcomes, then sure, it won't be that empowering. So it's rather how can that be connected to a broader design experience, which includes meaningful and measurable outcomes, which includes clear rules, which includes artificial conflict. So if you have those core features, then that can be helpful for advancing that along. If it's just having a role-play activity in an event, it can be helpful, it can be fun, it won't necessarily be empowering unless people are connected to actual decisions through that experience. But maybe take a couple more.
Do you have a top 3 favorite participatory civic engagement that's going on right now or that's included, just to give a broader picture of it?
Sure, and maybe a question here as well. Yeah, your question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what compelled the municipal authorities in the project you described to not only engage in the process with the community stakeholders, but also abide by the decisions that they make?
Great. So, yeah, for the first question, some good examples. Actually, I think Participatory Chinatown is a pretty good game. It's a planning game that started out in Boston and it is digital, but also is connected to planning processes. The redistricting game is another one, which is a game about redistricting, but which also then includes and connects players to lobby their representatives, and they actually have gone on a bunch of trips to DC. They've used it and integrated it into different nonprofits that are working on redistricting. So it's that connection between the game, but also the groups and the officials who are working to change districting. That's been really effective. And then, for me, a lot of the games and the process I take inspiration from, I think I come from Latin America, emerging out of popular education and theater of the oppressed processes. So one of the programs that I look at is theater of the oppressed in the city of Rosario, and which basically theater games are used as a way to act out and to plan concrete actions for addressing situations of oppression. So the program that I look at in Rosario, and it's a municipal program actually, is for youth workers to figure out how they're going to apply a new national children's rights law. That sounds great on paper and is not being implemented. And so, great, you have this law. What are the actual institutions of the city government going to do to apply it when a kid comes in saying that their parents are abusing? Or when a school principal says that you can't teach sex ed because it's against the school religion. So, laying out these concrete scenarios and then people through games figure out ways to actually build new policies that enact that law. So those I think are some of the great examples to look at. And that gets into the other question about how does a city like this end up taking this approach and then also respecting it and translating this into policy. There was a big culture of gaming that developed in Rosario over a few decades. Part of it was due to a very charismatic individual, actually, named Institutionalizing, who is now working at the province there and kind of legitimized play for the city over a couple decades, to the point where there's actually a city ordinance for a day of play games. So there's a day when city staff have to take off and play games. So it took a while to get to that point. Part of it was this charismatic individual. Part of it was the connection with popular education and other social movements, where play was seen and games were seen as an effective tool of social justice organizing. And a lot of what I hope the book communicates is that this isn't just fun and games, it's actually very effective politics and organizing. And a lot of the response I get in the States at first when I talk about this is it's trivial or that's not for real. In Latin America, I didn't find that so much. When I went around and saying them, researching how to use games and game design processes, the response I usually get was, oh yeah, we're doing that this way and that way and this way. And so there's much more of a culture of it down there, I think stemming from decades of social movement organizing and finding that it is very effective at engaging marginalized communities. So I hope that we can start to shift the discourse up here as well, seeing playing games not as this trivial side experiment that we can do, but actually as our responsibility for making democracy engaging. And if we want democracy to be functional, we can't have it be boring and painful and pointless. And too often that's what we settle for.
Did you answer?
Yeah. Sure. And I think it's kind of segueing what you were just mentioning, just about reflecting on here in the States. I was just wondering if you've done any reflection and maybe meetings and processes you've been involved with, that if we had more of this, that the outcome might have been different. So I think what I'm asking is, maybe I need to thumb through the book, but just, this measurable outcomes, kind of this artificial conflict, these constraints, just examples. I'm just looking for examples from our work that we can kind of try to compare or try to put in place. Well, we're thinking about design. So we have this big meeting next week, Thursday. We're doing this planning process with the city of Chicago right now for our commercial corridor. And we're running into a couple speed bumps. So that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to kind of look at the design of this meeting. And trying to use these rules, constraints, outcomes. I don't know if you can maybe share maybe some examples of what might be some tangible outcomes or constraints when planning for meetings here in the States.
Yeah. So one of the best examples, I'm biased a bit, but I think is participatory budgeting. And I think one of the reasons that participatory budgeting works is it's designed like a good game. So you start out with very real rules about how money can be spent, how much is available. That can be limiting at first, but also that can inspire a lot of creativity and a sense of accomplishment when people transcend them. You have very real conflicts. There's limited money and unlimited needs. And so people want all kinds of different projects with that. But the process structures that, on one hand, as this kind of group versus system conflict. So you have committees of community representatives or delegates, volunteers that are working together on projects and coming up with proposals for a ballot. And so they start to work together and see their conflict as we as a group need to figure out things that can be effectively done within these constraints. But part of that conflict also is what keeps me going, is that there's a bit of a competitive edge to it. People want their project funded and they go out and lobby for it, and I think that's good. And then most of all, there are those measurable outcomes. So people, when we invite them to a meeting, we say, come out and decide how to spend $1 million, which is very different from come out and voice your opinion on something. And you can see the outcomes afterwards, both the money allocated, but also the actual changes in your neighborhood. So that's one reason I think that participatory budgeting has spread so much, because it has those core criteria. And a challenge then for a lot of other processes is, what are the measurable outcomes? So what's going to look different in the world after people engage in your process that they're going to be able to see? How can you make that visible? How can you make that quantifiable? What's the conflict at stake? And can you frame that in a way where it's more focused on group work? So it's not just individual against individual, but where people can see the systemic constraints and work with you, each other against that. And being super clear about the rules too, and this is one of the easiest things actually to fix, where it is so many processes don't say how things work. All the rules are taken for granted, they're known by the folks in the know. And it's really frustrating for community participants to engage in that and not know when things get decided, who has the ultimate say over things, what are the technical constraints. So putting rules out there in really visible, accessible ways, assuming people won't understand them the first time you say them or the second time. So having them be on the wall, in handouts, said orally, embedded into the process. So like on the transparency cutouts, and if you can see about each of them, they actually have measurements, which say how big they are. So that the rules also about lot size are just embedded in the game. If you think about Monopoly, for example, how do you learn to collect $200 pass and go? Do you learn it by reading the instruction book? You learn it because it says on the board, collect $200 and pass and go. So we need to write more of those rules into the physical materials of meetings, of planning processes, and policy making processes, so people understand it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk a lot about the value of good design and having these sort of structures in place. And one of the things I talk about when I talk about participatory budgeting is to sort of quell any fears that it's just going to be this sort of cacophony of, and that's one of the reasons why community meetings break down, right? There's just like people screaming and there's no sort of structure. I say, no, there's just the opposite. It's a choreograph. Like there's kind of there's a greater structure here. There's a grand design here. But I think that may turn certain people off. I mean, and I think maybe getting back to sort of how do these work in the United States, where there's such a sort of long history of kind of individualism and nobody can tell me what to do or how to play. Who gets to design? You know, who sort of appoints themselves as the grand designer, and then how do you get people to consent to play? I mean, I think there's sort of because I think people might object to, you know. Or they may just sort of self-select. You end up with people who are kind of willing to maybe think more collectively and put their own sort of particularistic interests on hold to sort of, because it does, to play a game means in some ways to kind of, to sort of, to consent to these rules and to enter into this sort of separate space and not everybody is willing to do that. So I guess there's questions of, sort of who's designing, and then how do you kind of maximize participation if there is that sort of like, if the whole idea of playing in a designed environment doesn't necessarily agree with everyone.
Yeah, so a couple questions there. Actually, I think I'll reframe them a bit. I think one is about how do you bring people into play when that's not their norm, and they're starting out in a different space. So how do you ease people into this? And one really effective way is to gradually level up people's activity. So starting out with something that's very comfortable. So often when Icebreakers, I'll use asking a series of questions like I did for you guys, starting off asking folks to raise their hands, and asking them to clap, then stomp their feet, and wave their hands in the air. And in around 30 seconds you get them doing something that they wouldn't do when they started out. Or if you start out with a very easy activity, then they get used to moving, and they start to put themselves out there more. A lot of the experiences that I talk about in the book start out with icebreaker games as a way to get people physically comfortable with moving their bodies in new ways and with interacting in new ways, and recognizing that they're coming into that space expecting something very different. They're expecting to sit in a chair and listen, and their default is passivity, and it takes work to level up that passivity towards activity. Another big lesson there is that not everyone can do that. So there were some workshops at Rosario Habitat that were really lousy because they had staff who didn't get it, didn't have a very fun mentality, weren't effective communicators. So you can have the best design process in the hands of someone who doesn't know very well how to choreograph that, and it can flop. So it's really important then for staffing up for people who can actually effectively implement this. And that was one of their big lessons learned over time, was we need to be more careful about the staff we hire. And if we're asking them to do workshops like this, hire people who have this experience, who have a community orientation, who are communicators, and not expect that a random architect will be able to do this effectively. And then you can build the skills over time to some extent, but you can't expect someone who doesn't have any experience with that to come and do it effectively. And the other question, which also I think is really interesting, is this power of the designer. And can that be manipulative? Will folks be cynical about that and think that someone else is pulling the strings? And actually that was one of the issues I found in some of the programs I studied. When they had challenges, that was a big part of it, where folks felt that they were being a bit manipulated. that we had. They walked into this space where there was this whole laid out plan for them, and do this, do that, do that, do that, do that, and it just felt like they were being moved along like puzzle pieces. The way that I've learned at least to effectively deal with that is to think about design not as designing experiences, but designing structures for experience. So you're not designing what people will do. When you start to design what people will do, that's where you get in trouble. But if you design structures for meaningful experience, design structures in which people can do meaningful things, in which they can take different routes, where they can make different decisions, that's an enabling form of design. And effective games do that really well, where they create this structure that enables people to make all kinds of decisions and feel empowered through the process. A lot of games that flop do so because people feel like they're being leveled up. The game is actually designing what they do, as opposed to creating a space that enables them to make decisions. But yeah, that's definitely one of the key challenges. That's something that I think we struggle with a lot actually, is having a plan that is effective, that tackles the issues that you want to tackle, that fits within the time you have for a workshop, but also that feels empowering, doesn't feel like we're being led along. To answer your question. Joe?
On the same lines, to what extent does the fact that the game is more simulative or more of a simulation versus an abstract representation of something about the process, to what extent does that matter? Make a difference?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of ways to make that. So one is, there are some games that are simulations, which can play a valuable role. So the theater of the oppressed games I talked about when they're trying to figure out how to enact the policy, they're simulations. They're acting out scenarios and figuring out how to engage with them. They're not actually doing them at the workplace when there's a kid outside saying that the parent is abusing him. And so those can be great spaces for mapping out and envisioning actions in very applied scenarios. Then there's also games like Rosario Habitat where it's not a scenario, they're planning their block. It's not this abstract thing where afterwards they'll sit down and plan it. This is the planning process. And that's what I found very exciting, is that it's not about putting a game into a planning process, it's about actually redesigning decision making as a game-like process, using game mechanics, and changing the way those decisions are made. So those to me are the real exciting processes, where we're taking the actual point of power before making decisions and redesigning the way folks can engage with that. Yeah, that's a great question.
I guess looking at the U.S. Communities versus Latin American communities, do Latin American communities have a different view on how what it takes for them to engage in a planning process for hours and hours at a time versus a U.S. community? Is what you're describing sounds as though it's at least a full day process. And
it's a multi-year process.
Or it would be a process that would require people to devote a significant amount of time to participating and being engaged in it. Is that something that you find? What are the cultural differences in trying to do that in Latin America versus the U.S.?
So I guess first of all, I would say that democracy takes time. And if it's not taking time, it's probably not democracy. So it took often a couple years for them to get from first meeting to plan for their neighborhood. And the same way that participatory budgeting takes several months for people to get from here's my crazy idea to a project that's in the ballot that can be implemented. And often we assume people won't want to participate that long, and so we design really short processes that don't give them a chance to engage meaningfully. So let's have a 2-hour meeting, because people aren't going to come out for longer than that. And in that meeting, they're not going to be given a chance to really decide anything. And so then they don't want to come, because why should I go out to a meeting when it's not going to have any impact? So what these experiences showed to me is that if people see that there's actual impact, they'll engage. The same way that people spend millions of hours playing games because they see that it's meaningful and it's enjoyable. So it's not, I don't think we have to view democracy as this kind of civic chore that how can we get people to eat their spinach and just kind of swallow it down and get them to do more and more of it, but rather recognizing that's actually a valuable part of our lives and that people want to be spending time in this if it's an enjoyable, meaningful experience. And it shouldn't be either have fun or come out to a meeting. As far as the cultural differences, that's on one hand, there's much more of a tradition in Latin America of folks coming out and spending 5 hours debating politics on a Tuesday evening. On the other hand, there's a lot of traditions of very active engagement in the US as well. If you go back to the Tocqueville and the town hall meetings, and people still spend a lot of time in those kinds of meetings when they feel they're rewarding. There's a book by Francesca Paletta called Freedom is an Endless Meeting, looking at the 60 social movements, and how those endless meetings were what felt so liberatory, that people coming together and shaping their future was great fun for a lot of folks, and really meaningful. So I agree it's a challenge. People aren't as accustomed to coming out for these things, but whenever the experience is made meaningful, they want to keep coming back. Even if they're reluctant at first, and usually if I'm doing a workshop like this, people are reluctant at first, and plan for that. That's one tips for anyone who wants to do these kinds of activities. Assume that people will not want to do them, and assume that after doing them, they'll be glad they did them. And so lead people through it, and say, get up, and we're going to play a game. And if you stop when the first person hesitates, then you won't get anywhere, and they won't get anywhere. But everyone afterwards enjoys it. And everyone afterwards is really glad that they've done it. And yeah, is there anyone else who hasn't asked a question too before we go to others? Okay, yeah.
Is there any desire on the part of participants or the architects of the game to remain in contact with each other after that initial episode? And if so, does it happen? If it happens, what is the feedback that you receive?
Good question. So there's actually a game mechanic for that. And in the book I talk about game mechanics, which are kind of the key components and structures that designers use to design effective games. You can think of it as kind of the gears that make a game go. And so a game mechanic called metagames. So basically the game about the game, or the community about the game. And again, soccer or football is a great example. There's the game of soccer, and then there's a whole huge community that's built up around that, of fan clubs, of websites, of people being members of clubs, and that's often as engaging as the game itself, as that broader community that enables folks to communicate outside of the game, and even people who aren't even playing the game to communicate with each other. One example of this in the US, and it's a very different example, but America's Army, which is the Army's game. And whatever you may think of it instrumentally or politically, it's very effective, and partly because it has a huge metagame presence. There's there's newsletters, there's chat forums, there's all these ways of engaging people in the game experience, such that by the end of it, a lot of folks want to join the Army. And it's been a very effective tool for them at recruitment and at skill building, by building up that broader community around the game. So if you check out their website, you'll see what I mean. But it's really as active as any big football club. And it's for the Army. It's for one of the main institutions of power in this country. Yeah. And so we should probably, I don't know how we're doing for time. I guess we'll wrap up soonish.
We have time for a few more questions.
And maybe after this question too, I want to ask a question for you guys. And if folks are,
Make us play a game.
no, it's not a game actually. We can do that too. But if you are engaged in processes now, where you're trying to think through, how would I make this more fun? How would I integrate game design or games into it? I'm going to put that forward to the group, and we can try some collective problem solving of how you'd restructure your program or process. So if folks are thinking about anything in the back of their head after you're done this meeting.
I wanted to share one thing. I have a specific question. So I just wanted to say, I don't know if you know this, but the Center for Neighborhood Technology located in Chicago has used games for urban planning, for urban transportation planning. So if people don't know about it, we have interesting innovation right here. going on in that space? There was a lot going on in 2009, 2010, and then I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, and to build on your first point, I do want to lift up, there's a lot of great organizations in this country that are using games already and game design techniques, game mechanics and processes. And want to build on that. And what we're trying to do is look at what's making those work. So not saying this is something that's happening in Argentina, not anywhere else, it's springing up here. In Argentina, I've found some of the best developed processes like this, but there's a lot of great work happening in the States around this too. For Second Life, I mean, it's still out there. I'm not super engaged, and I think that a lot of the initial buzz of possibilities hasn't been realized. That's my impression. But the other thing about that is that I guess when designing games, think about who is the target audience, who are you trying to empower and engage with the games. And for me at least, spaces like Second Life are pretty inequitable as far as participation. So you have much more affluent, more educated communities participating there. So I guess who is that empowering when you're thinking about what spaces you want to engage people in? And even as that changes and the digital divide issues, it's not a strict yes or no divide, but studies constantly show that more affluent people have more access to and more skill at using digital technologies. And so when we ground our processes in places like Second Life, we're biasing them towards more affluent communities. And yeah, so I would really encourage having face-to-face communication and engagement be a core part of the process. Which doesn't mean that you can't have an online component of digital technologies, but just building it on the established means of communication in low-income and marginalized communities, which are predominantly face-to-face. Does anyone have any programs or projects they're working on that they want to redesign or that you've been to that you think should be redesigned?
Well, I do a lot of role playing and sort of scenario setting in my classes. So I teach a negotiation class. I just did a negotiation, and we work on this for a month. Like, and I give the class divides into different groups. I give them background information, and then we come together for this sort of final negotiation. What I found, I feel like I need to redesign this negotiation because there's such a, even though the students, I will say, do a very valiant job of getting into character and really sort of like the developer really is an asshole, and you know, the community organization, you know, does they try all kinds of tactics to get their voices heard in this negotiation. But there's such an emphasis on like, there's such a desire to like reconcile and to, you know, to have everything end up, you know, kind of a happy ending. So I don't know how to add any more sort of, because oftentimes in these kinds of site fights and development conflicts, there's no happy ending, you know. And so I don't know how to add more of a dose of realism or how to kind of keep the how to make the game in effect sort of more realistic and more conflictual than the students want it. They see, you know, the end of the 3-hour time period, it's kind of coming, they realize, oh, we got to start kind of conceding a lot more, and before you know it, everybody's, you know, hugging and holding hands, and, you know, and that's not how it works. So I don't know how to bring a, you know, like that, like I said, sort of a more realistic sense of conflict and like unresolved issues into a classroom kind of setting.
It's funny, so there's a group in New York called the Center for Pedagogy we work with, and they do great both graphic design but also experience design and try to make urban issues accessible and engaging for folks in the community. And they designed a game around the zoning process in New York, a board game, which is similar, I think, to the scenario you laid out, where there's developers, there's community groups, there's small businesses, there's residents, and they have to go through the zoning process to get new development approved. And people usually lose the game. It's set up to be realistic, and so almost everyone loses, except for the developers. Which on one hand can be a bit frustrating, but also is very real. And I think one of the things they found through that game is that it's useful to have people see that it's not all going to end up happy easily. And that we shouldn't expect just coast through this process. That actually the way the game is set up, it's rigged. And that you should expect to lose. but using that as a starting point for them brainstorming ways around that may not even fit within the constraints of the game. So once people have been through that process and see how rigged it is, then they'll often follow up with some brainstorming and visioning sessions around, okay, what will we change in this process so that it's not rigged? So that gets into the metagame space, thinking about the game and thinking about how you would change it. Because sometimes the game's pretty established and it's really awful. And people don't have a chance of winning it. That's where you can go through the game, play it, learn about it, but then step outside of it as well. But being realistic is important. You don't want to have false expectations. People think that, oh, this is maybe a breeze, we'll just get our affordable housing built and the developer will back
Right, the
down.
developer conceded to everything we asked for. How did that happen?
Yeah.
Is it the Center for Urban Pedagogy?
Center for Urban Pedagogy.
So I work in real life with community groups who are often organizing and selling and planning petitions, or city councils, school boards, whatever it is. And the community groups 90% of the time lose. But what concerns me is we're calling this making democracy more fun, but we're giving into these big groups or the builders, and we're saying even the process is a sham, which it seems to be most of the time. So how can we utilize these games and get city leaders kind of is where I would love to take this back to, you know, I know of a mayor in a town west of here that she's trying to be more engaging and say this is a way to engage your citizens. But I also am concerned that, like, by giving her something like this, is she's going to rig it. So that's where, because the process is, right? And that's just my general feelings, and I would love if we had something that I could present to her or any of the other communities I work with.
And one thing I would say is that the process I described in games and game design is not for everyone all the time. And especially for really challenging political contexts, you may not want to start out with this kind of process, but thinking strategically about where it's most likely to be effective and building on that. And once people see it working elsewhere, it becomes easier for them to envision it working and easier for you to then push for them to make it a meaningful process. So I wouldn't say to start in a place where it's the most challenging context and it's most set up to fail, because it probably will. And I'm not just talking about games, but meaningful engagement in general. But if you can think of places where there is some good support, there's some elected official support, some community support, some resources there to make this effective. And it does take resources too. And it's a lot easier just to have a meeting where you have a mic at the front of the room and we'll talk than to design an engaging experience. So recognizing the work it takes to do this well. But then also just showing how it does pay off. That people actually are happier with elected officials and with government when they feel like they can participate meaningfully. That it prevents backlash for people having signed on to things and not knowing what they were signing on to, and then stabbing, for example. But I mean, even without the stabbing, we see this all the time, where officials have a pretty shallow process, think the community is called on, and there's huge protests afterwards when they realize that engagement wasn't meaningful. So it's very costly for democracy not to be fun. It's very costly for it to be boring, because then people don't participate and they can push back when officials think they've figured out the solution to things. So it's not just about having a good time, but actually about being able to effectively implement policies. And a lot of officials are struggling with this now of how to meaningfully engage people. And the bar has been raised a bit. People expect more now than just to be able to come up to the front of the room and speak for a few minutes. And a lot of officials and governments don't have the tools or the know-how to be able to make that a meaningful experience. So the way I try and frame it is, here's a way to help you accomplish your goals and have more people work with you in that, rather than work against you. It's not going to be for everyone, but I think I'm finding more and more governments and organizations are interested in that. Yeah. Probably I should.
Well, if there aren't any other questions,